I'm very pleased to be here this morning. When the rabbi, I think, first called me some weeks ago, months ago, I said that I would put it at the top of my list for this weekend, and did so, and then it works out that I'm here. I was especially pleased because it is a community group, and I very often do not get to be a part of MLK activities where a community is celebrated in various ways. So I'm delighted to be here. Because this is the Solidarity Network, Interfaith Solidarity Network, I'm going to start with the reality of my life and work that fundamentally represents a mystical experience and a spiritual experience of profound importance to me, that fundamentally confirmed me in a way of life and a way of understanding the religion of Jesus, and of pointing my life in work. And the story, which I have rarely told publicly, goes like this. My connections with Martin Luther King Jr. Are not ordinary connections. They are mystical, providential connections. Because I became convinced at a very early age that the ethics and teachings of Jesus, and notice I'm not going to use Jesus Christ because I think Christianity, in saying Jesus Christ, has done a lot of great damage both to the teachings of Jesus and to religion in the world. But Jesus of Nazareth's teachings, it seems to me, represent a prophetic vision of religion, and I wanted to pursue that for my early reading of the scriptures, of the Bible itself. I turned the other cheek. I stopped beating up on people who used racist epithets on me by the 4th grade in Ohio, which I want to therefore insist with you that racism is a national disease and always has been. Because that's where I met it first, at age 4, in the streets of Lawson. I translated that in high school. By the time I was hitting high school, I knew that I would obey no racist law. I would not support any form of despising of other people. And in high school, that began to expand in terms of no despising of Roman Catholics. There was a Protestant community and a lot of anti-Roman Catholic stuff. And that very clearly I would be not in the corner of any kind of anti-Semitism. I rejected that by high school. My first year in college, I started reading Gandhi of India, his autobiography. And that made me recognize, among other things, that my faith and practice was really, could be called a soul force practice, a nonviolent work. That was literally an essential interpretation of the religion of Jesus, which the Christian church has largely ignored across the centuries. And so, as I studied Gandhi, I then began to study what was nonviolent events in the United States, in South Africa, in Europe, in India in particular, in Asia. I became both a practitioner and a devotee of nonviolent theology and ethics and faith and methodology. By 1952, where I'd served already by 52 13 months in a federal prison because I said that selective service acts are wrong. So I will not cooperate with the draft act. I spent 13 months in jail instead. All a part of this leading of the spirit. But by 1952, I was a little bit angry with the fact that we black people and black organizations had not risen up using nonviolent tactics to change the spread of Jim Crow law, segregation, and racism. But that by 1952, I knew mystically, spiritually, by 1952, I knew that the United States was going to have a nonviolent movement that was going to shake this nation and that it would come out of the black community, and that I've been prepared to work in it. I didn't know where it was going to begin or how it was going to begin, but I knew absolutely, one of the few people in the United States who thought, who discovered that this country could be changed, did not have to march relentlessly as it was marching in the 20th century towards being a segregated, racist, sexist, violent, plantation capitalist society. It could change. And so, of course, one of my happiest days was in 1955 when the bus boycott began. I actually met the news in early December in Nagpur, India, where I was a coach and phys ed teacher and campus minister at Hislop College as a Methodist missionary. So it was one of the happiest days of my life. That's where I met the name of Martin Luther King Jr. And that's where I knew that Martin and I would one day be hand in hand, and I knew that he was my spokesperson for this struggle. I had no ambitions whatsoever for being as actively engaged as I was, but I knew that King was my spokesperson and a leader chosen by God, chosen by history. So it was a mystical relationship that changed my life, that caused me to become wedded, in fact, to Martin King. So I was active then I'll start over. When we met in 1956, when we shook hands for the first time and had our first conversation at Oberlin College, on the campus of Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, I had planned to move south as quickly as I could, but King, I was going to do a graduate degree, including a doctorate, but King said to me quietly, don't wait, you must come now, because we need you now. By that time, I had spent 10 years in the study of nonviolent struggle, in history and theology and biblical understanding. 10 years of it as a part of my vocational life, vocational work. So I'm giving you what I know to have been a spiritual, moral experience that transformed my life, put my life on a different trajectory. That's the first thing I want to say. So that meant that, yes, I became the teacher of the emerging nonviolent movement in the United States. So many people. Dr. King himself, I did my first workshop on nonviolence for the newly organized Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the vehicle that Martin King helped to found and conceive of as a vehicle for nonviolent struggle. And did workshops for all of SCLC people, was one of the founders of SNCC. And Dr. King and I were the first advisors for that effort. Then was with him in the sit-in campaign, the Freedom Ride, the Albany movement, 10 or 15 campaigns that had a major central So the first thing I wanted to do is ask you to enlist you in a cause. We must stop calling Martin Luther King Jr. a civil rights leader. I'm going to say that boldly. Because Martin Luther King Jr. prepared to be a preacher, prophet, teacher, theologian, PhD in theology from Boston University. He prepared all his life. He said all the time, "I'm a pastor." To say that what happened with King is a part of this, is a civil rights movement, is a disgrace. It's also racist. Also, religions then do not have to face up to the fact of the nonviolent spirituality and methodology and history of the human family that King represents for Western civilization. So if you want to describe what Martin King was the founder and leader and strategist for, call it, in the words of John Lewis, the congressman, who incidentally was one of my students. I met him in 1958 and taught him and others nonviolent history, theory, practice, biblical interpretation of nonviolent interpretation of the Bible, many major stories. And John was one of our finest young men of our struggle in Nashville for some 4 years or so. Call Dr. King's work the Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks Nonviolent Movement of America. Or call it, as some historians do, the Black Freedom Movement, the Black Justice Movement. Or, if you will, call it the Black Church Movement. A few church historians maintain that it was the finest intervention in church history, in Christianity, in the 20th century. You can go look that up. Some church historians call what King represents and symbolizes the finest change in Christianity of the 20th century. Call it the Black Church Movement. We could not have done what we did without the Black Church. Now, 99% of the Black Church may not have been for us, but in the southeastern part of the country, we could not meet in any school building. We could not meet in any public building. There were no auditoriums that would allow us to meet. When we had mass meetings, for example, in the Birmingham campaign in 1963, in order to face up to the responsibility of that campaign, we had on the same night mass meetings in 5 different churches. And Martin King would go to each of the 5 different churches. And did that for a number of weeks because we had no sizable place for the crowds who participated in the mass meetings. So we had to make do with what we had. So the task I want for this Solidarity Network is this: that you see King as a theologian called of God, who led and caused the uprising in Western civilization of a nonviolent movement which calls for a radical 180-degree turn, not only of Western history, but of the religions, what we do, and of especially the United States. No simple civil rights. I do not disparage the civil rights movement, but the use of the term civil rights means, therefore, that many people in the United States of all complexions do not understand what the movement did for them. I've had incidents across the years of black pastors telling other people, well, no, the civil rights movement was our movement. It's not you. It's not your movement. You can't call yourself a civil rights movement. There are incidents like that reported by the media, in the press, that you can look up. In California, in Baltimore, as well. But then here's the worst thing. Too many white people maintain the civil rights movement is about Negroes, not about the United States. Most USA people do not even know that the fight over federal judgeships and the Supreme Court is a very simple struggle. It is this. In the 18th century and the 19th century into around 1950s and 60s, the Supreme Court of the United States did not include in their interpretations, you will not find a single opinion of that court that says that black people have fundamental human rights, that applies the Constitution to the women of the nation, or that applies the Constitution to the Indians, or to people, or to the criminal. Go study this for yourself. Not a single Supreme Court decision in the first half of the 20th century, the 19th century, or the 18th century says that the Constitution is inclusive of all the people, all the residents of this land. And most of our sisters and brothers in the United States of America do not know that that was one of the earliest achievements of what can be called the civil rights movement. The NAACP in the 1920s and 1930s decided they would take the Constitution to court. They would take racism and Jim Crow law and segregation to the court. So a man by the name of Charles Houston Davis was dean of the law school at Howard University in D.C. And that law school with the NAACP said, we're going to make the Supreme Court a laboratory of our teaching at law school. And we're going to produce lawyers who are going to take discrimination of black people to the highest court, and we're going to see to it that the Constitution is declared as being inclusive of everyone. One of the major victories, May 17th, 1954, was that unanimous decision. The first time. Well, the nation doesn't even know that the battle over the federal court system that Mitch McConnell is so cleverly hiding in the nation is designed by the so-called neoconservative people who are actually racist people and sexist people and violent people and plantation capitalist people. I remember as they merged back in the 60s and 70s. He's trying to get this federal court system to do something that's pretty nefarious. Supreme Court's decision has said the Constitution is inclusive of all. Where this group of people, some of them are very invisible, is working is this. They're going to have not a racist system or religious system based upon the Constitution, but they're going to have a racist system and a sexist system based upon individual conscience. They're going to make it possible. Well, the work has already started. A baker in Denver, a man walked in off the street, a baker, and saw his beautiful display of wedding cakes. Said to the baker, would you make my wedding cake for me? Turned out his fiancée was another man. You know this. The baker took that case, said, my consciousness, my conscience does not allow me to bake that cake for that man, for that couple. They took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, You have a conscience that says you can't treat gay, lesbian people the same way you treat other people. He won the case. Hobby Lobby took another case to that Supreme Court in which Hobby Lobby said, we do not have to pay health care for women's reproductive rights if it includes abortions. And the same Supreme Court said, you're right. You have a conscience on this matter of gay, lesbian people. You don't have to obey that law. Now go check all this out for yourselves. Because that's where the people who call themselves neoconservative are moving us. They will get their case from some restaurant that will say, I know that by my religious consciousness, a person of color is inferior to me, and I can't serve them. And that case is coming down the pike. It's on the table somewhere right now. So they're going to they're after getting an individual conscience to outweigh the Constitution. So I'm saying all of this to say that the fight over federal judgeships in the Supreme Court is a fight over whether or not this nation will be a nation where we continue to resist racism, sexism, violence, and plantation capitalism. And I maintain that these four elements that I've named are the spiritual forces of wickedness in our country and have been for 200, 300 years. And that if we do not collectively see them, they all provide a spiritual poison that says some people are not equal. All people have not been created by the same life force. They also want structures that permit racism to stay in place. And they all support plantation capitalism in the United States, where the rich get richer and ordinary people get poorer. I use that term plantation capitalism because it's an accurate term of how our economy began. In the 13 colonies, even in California, in the Western world settlements, the western part of this continent settlements, was through plantation capital. The rise of large landowners, some with slaves, but with poverty, workers of one kind and another, and the plantation becomes a center of political power, social power, religious power in the regions where they are, whether Wyoming or Sunflower County in Mississippi. Now I've gone too long already, but I want to say, I want to finally enlist, I want to enlist you to use the language that King Rosa Parks' nonviolent movement, black church movement, or social justice movement, or black freedom movement, instead of the term civil rights, use civil rights as an omnibus historical movement with many, many different dimensions. The CRM labeling helps to eliminate significant human history in this country. So I name, for example, Little Rock 9 should not be called the Civil Rights Movement. It's though a part of it. It should be understood as the Little Rock 9 movement. The desegregation of baseball is never called civil rights. It's called desegregation of baseball. It's an extraordinary story of what CRM means. The desegregation of Southeastern Conference, the desegregation of football in colleges. These are all dimensions of the larger umbrella the CRM. But they are rarely called the CIM, though they were part of the whole vast movement of the last 130 or 40 years. So CRM represents to me the historical frame that came out of Congress, 1866. The recognition of Congress at the end of the Civil War that the Constitution excluded more people than it included. Of the right to vote, for example, basic civil rights. And so they coined the term civil rights, and the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is the first appearance of that term, civil rights, started by a Republican Congress in 1866 that extended civil rights to all black people, all women, all residents of our society except the Indian are in that act. They say that basic civil rights, human rights, are the right of all residents of our society except the Indian. 1866. Well, I'm going to wrap this up now very clearly. So I invite you to join this analysis. Call the movement basically the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, nonviolent movement of America. So that you gather the full sweep of that historic struggle. That's the first thing I want to say. And that movement did begin the dismantling of segregation. Did begin the process. The southern part of the country was completely committed to the notion that we will become a rigidly divided nation through race. That movement stopped those plans and was the first uprising of the people of the United States against the Ku Klux Klan, the people of the churches who adopted their theology, and the notion that segregation is the will of God. So I press you on that, every ounce of energy that I can apply. Another part of that is that we must recognize that Martin Luther King Jr. is the first Western person who led any kind of a movement around the rubric of nonviolent history, theology, methodology, and tactics. And what that means is that Martin Luther King Jr. has said that it has called for a paradigm change. Western civilization must give up its violence, or it will extinguish itself and maybe much of the planet and much of the earth. The violence in our world is largely an invention of Western civilization. If you think I make a mistake, take a look at the Africa Command of our Pentagon. Last year they announced we have 6,000 troops in 43 countries in Africa. 6,000 troops in 43 countries in Africa. Of course, we're there to advise them. But we have boots on the ground in the northeastern section of the Congo. We've had boots on the ground in Sudan and Somalia, for an example. So our historic, economic, and military policy is that Africa will become like Iraq and Iran, devastated by violence, so that somehow Western world can have a hold upon them. No government will be allowed in those 43 countries that does not want to go into the free market economy, plantation capitalism economy. No governmental leaders will be allowed who think there must be an alternative way for their people to the free market system, which is the United States God. It's a god or a goddess. Idolatry, the way it's talked about and followed in that country. So then finally, I'm going to make quickly 3 points. And I put these down quickly. I'm not going to talk about them. Sisters and brothers, religion must stop blessing the despising of any other human beings for whatever reason. The world religions all agree that love and compassion are at the heart of any authentic religious spirit. Religions must write out of their history and out of their scriptures and poetry and music any suspicion that hatred has some role in their world, or has some role for the shaping of human life. Secondly, the world religions must wipe out of their experience the blessing of violence in every form, no matter how hard that might be. If you think violence has some validity, well, take a good hard look at Northern Africa and what's called the Middle East and Central Asia, where we have been engaged in violence almost for 50 years in various ways, if not longer. And it of course has blessed the women and children of the area, right? It's helped form stable families. It has helped to create infrastructures of great schools and hospitals and homes and the rest of it. For how long will we give support to a system that has been so devastating to so many uncounted people? For how long will we keep doing the same thing and pretend that doing the same thing somehow has ethical value in the universe? We of the United States of America have had a foreign policy that is aimed at the domination and control of the earth and its resources on behalf of Western civilization. And we have pursued that policy with our more than 800 military bases around the world, on every continent. More than 800 military bases and installations in more than 100 countries around the world. It's now higher than that. I've not researched it recently. With Africa Command, it's now more than that. More than 100 countries. So how long will we of the churches and the synagogues and their temples, how long will we, those of us who say that we're religious, support in the United States this policy that uses more than half of our budget annually and produces chaos, domination, not truth, and not justice, and not a better world? That's what the nonviolent movement says has to be abolished, whether we like it or not. Has to be abolished. So religion must stop apologizing and blessing all forms of violence. And the worst form of violence is the domestic forms. Forms of violence in families, streets. This abject killing that goes on, more than 4 people at one time, according to the FBI, every week in the United States. We were not like that in my childhood or young adulthood. That level of decay in our land has only occurred since around the 70s and 80s. So we didn't grow up that way. So our religions have to. And then thirdly, our religions have to uncover in their own histories and scriptures and literature and music the soul force history that so often has never been described in our history books or social science books or religious books. The soul force powers that in many ways produced us, caused our religions to begin. And to lift up that soul force power as the way in which we must be organized for the healing of life, and for the healing of the nation. So I just give you this final point. As king, there's about 100 clergy people in the South joined with Martin King in 57, 58 to organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The motto that was adopted by that nonviolent movement was redeeming the soul of America. Not civil rights, but to somehow heal and lift and empower the spiritual life of the nation, that we could then take the magnificent visions that are in our two historical documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Take those documents, make them the most relevant documents of the country, and let this people become an illustration in the world of men and women and children whose bloodlines and genes go all the way back to the entire world, every continent, that such a people can become a people and can help the human race itself